My name is Bautista. I direct the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. It's a citywide coalition of community-based organizations fighting against the disproportionate environmental burdens in our communities, as well as the lack of environmental amenities in our communities. We were founded in 1991. It actually was at the beginning of the city's environmental justice movement. It was founded in part because we had these really kind of excellent guerrilla fights springing up in the South Bronx against a medical waste incinerator, Williamsburg against the proliferation of waste transfer stations, Sunset Park and Red Hook against sludge treatment plants. And what became clear to all our communities was that if we were going to deal with the root causes of these problems, these systemic problems that arose from decades of both private sector neglect and public sector indifference, that we needed to band together and basically fight those fights in a unified basis to deal with the problems that were at the root of citywide and statewide policies. It's kind of, we kind of liken ourselves like the Avengers, right? Those fights that Thor and Hulk and Iron Man can't fight alone, they band together. You know, that joke falls flat every single time. Ron told me not to do it this time, and I guess stubbornness is resilient too, so what can I tell you guys? So, did I drop something? Nice, okay. So, our exposure, no pun intended, to climate change actually dates back to the 90s. What happened in the late 90s, New York City started updating its coastal zone management plan. It's called the New York City, the Waterfront Revitalization Program. And, from our community's perspective, the issue, this was yet one more example of citywide policies that were concentrating and clustering the heaviest industrial and heavy chemical uses in the same handful of communities. Mindy touched on, there's a context to this stuff, right? There were decades of deindustrialization and urban renewal and planned shrinkage. New York City lost, what was it, over 1 million manufacturing jobs from the 40s through the 70s alone. We lost tens of thousands of longshoremen waterfront jobs when containerization came in and those jobs disappeared. And so from our perspective, if you look at the concentration of these facilities in our communities, they tended to coincide with the exodus of manufacturing. Because where else are you going to build waste treatment plants, power plants, sewage treatment plants? It's going to go where the heaviest manufacturing is allowed. And one of the kind of ironies, or irony is probably not the right word for it, but one of the dynamics in New York City, and it's replicated in cities across the country, is that as cities turn their backs to manufacturing, manufacturing land started getting rezoned to residential. And what happens is when you do that, when you take more and more manufacturing land off the table, you basically are left with fewer and fewer parcels of land where you could put all the heaviest, nastiest infrastructure. And that, tends to be environmental justice communities in New York. Our members are from the South Bronx, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Bushwick, Sunset Park, West Harlem, Morningside Heights. And it's no coincidence to us that these are where some of the last clusters of heavy manufacturing land is left in the city. When the city began updating its coastal zone management plan, it introduced a concept. You guys know how coastal zone management plans work out. They basically break activities along the waterfront. It's like 4 basic categories. You've got the natural waterfront, you've got the recreational waterfront, you've got the working waterfront, and then you've got the as we euphemistically call in New York City, the redeveloping waterfront, otherwise known as the gentrifying waterfront. And in the working waterfront category, a new category was introduced called Significant Maritime and Industrial Areas, or SMIAs. There are only 6 of those in New York City, and they are in the South Bronx, Newtown Creek, which is along the Williamsburg, Queens waterfront, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and the North Shore of Staten Island. And let me preface the presentation by saying, the environmental justice movement is difficult for a variety of reasons, one of which is we're not anti-industrial. We, in fact, see part of our core mission, industrial retention. That's part of our mission. There's got to be a place there's got to be a place where working people in our town can still work. And that remains smaller and smaller, but still significant thousands still of small manufacturing jobs located along our city's waterfronts. The New York City Economic Development Corporation did an analysis a few years ago where they looked at the average annual salary of the manufacturing sector in New York, and I know it's a broad range of activities that kind of got analyzed, but the average annual salary is about $60,000 a year. And when you're looking at communities that, are not college bound, that these are not, the only other alternative for a lot of our communities is either, the underground economy or service sector jobs, $60,000 a year doesn't look so bad. But we are also unstinting in our demand that environmental quality and environmental protection is not to be compromised. I mean, we would like to think that we're beyond those kind of old paradigms where economic development and environmental protection are set needlessly against each other. No, we need both, and we insist on both. To give you a sense of just probably the starkest example of environmental disparities in our, I mentioned some of the pieces of infrastructure. The one that's probably the most glaring is the city's solid waste management system. New York City generates, some people know this, 11,000 tons per day of residential waste, a staggering amount of waste. What most people don't realize is we generate double that, more than twice that in commercial waste. We generate over 26,000 tons per day of commercial waste, which means that New York City generates over 36,000 tons per day of solid waste. It is a staggering amount of waste. That waste is exported. It's in fact, I think it's New York's largest export, right? It's exported through a series of land-based waste transfer stations. It's mostly trucked. We managed to win a significant victory a few years ago where we pushed for basically the radical restructuring of the city's waste export infrastructure. So we're looking at a barge and rail-based system of export. But still, we're still exporting our waste, and we're still dumping that waste in landfill communities and EJ communities along the eastern seaboard. But just to give you guys a sense of what it means within the 5 boroughs, there's maybe 5 communities that handle 80% of the city's solid waste. South Bronx handles 30% of the city's solid waste, while having maybe 5 to 6% of its total population. And it was at that same historic moment when these explosion of waste transfer stations happened in the late 80s, early 90s, that you could trace the spike in asthma rates in the South Bronx, where Hunts Point, which is one of the neighborhoods of the South Bronx, at one point had 12 times the national average of childhood hospitalization for asthma rates. So as Mindy and others have said, there are consequences to these things. And in terms of the clusters of these uses, when the city designated through its coastal zone management plan significant maritime and industrial areas, this was now an official city policy sanctioning clustering and concentration of heavy polluting. And again, the challenge for us is how do we come up with reforms where we keep the industrial base, what's left of the industrial base in New York City, but take head on the issue of disproportionate environmental burdens. So the late 90s, and I think Mindy mentioned it before, those are the years of the Giuliani administration. So about the only thing that the Giuliani administration was more hostile to than environmental protection was civil rights, and you combine those two things, and we were dead in the water. So we were never able to get SMIA reform going in the late 90s. Fast forward 20 years, and 15 years, and in 2010, the Bloomberg administration launches its new update for the city's comprehensive waterfront plan that's going to transition into a new waterfront revitalization program, a coastal zone management plan. And so with this administration, we think we have a shot. This is an enlightened administration, and Ron already outed me, so yeah, I did work for the Bloomberg administration for the second term. One of the various reasons I went to work for the administration was because, in my memory, I couldn't remember another mayor who had the level of commitment to public health and environmental protection that Bloomberg had. So, and it was in that second term that Plan YC was developed and rolled out, and a lot of really great forward-thinking, visionary policies ensued from that. third term comes, I leave. But anyway, so I go to the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and it's at that moment that the city launches its coastal zone management plan. So we now have a shot at revisiting this fight, at really getting reforms for the significant maritime and industrial areas. So what we have in 2010 that we didn't have in the 90s was climate change and storm surge projections. So this is probably, you're probably not going to be able to see this well, but this is a map of the city's waterfronts. And there are 6 designations along this map, A, B, C, D, E, and F. They are the significant maritime and industrial areas. From top to bottom, again, it's the South Bronx, Newtown Creek, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and North Shore of Staten Island. And what was startling to us, and I guess now in retrospect, nobody should have been surprised, but what we realized was that every single one of these neighborhoods where the city was consciously clustering the heaviest manufacturing and chemical uses were all in the path of storm surge zones, every last one of them. And I'm talking, forget Category 4, I'm talking nor'easters, I'm talking tropical storms, I'm talking stiff winds. I mean, every single one of these neighborhoods was in the storm surge zone. And so all of a sudden, I mean, we'd like to think that if we were designing a city from scratch today, we'd be smarter than clustering all our heaviest chemical use in the path of storm surges. But this is the hand we've been collectively dealt. It's not just New York City. Go to any waterfront city in the country, and the waterfront, historically, had been where all the nastiest uses had been consigned, right? It's only been the last 40 or 50 years that we're talking luxury housing on the waterfront. For most of urban history, the waterfronts where you didn't want, where things went to be out of sight, out of mind, right? The heaviest industry, longshoremen, immigrants, right? All the stuff that society didn't want to deal with out on the waterfront. So all of a sudden, we've realized that we had this an additional layer, a movement that now is kind of emerging from the environmental justice movement called the climate justice movement, is now looking at what do these historic burdens mean in the context of climate change and newer threats. So what we started doing is when we realized that every single one of them were in storm surge zones, we started doing some additional research and tried to get a sense of, well, what are the threats? What are we looking at? We did over 100 maps, and I'm not going to do this to you guys, so I'm just going to give you guys a couple of examples. But we looked, for example, at multiple environmental databases, and we started doing overlays of those onto these significant maritime industrial area maps. And so this first map, for example, is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. This is one of their databases. It's where they have all the permits collected for chemical, bulk, and major oil storage facilities. And these are facilities that store hazardous substances with the capacity to store 400,000 gallons or more of oil. And on the left, you'll see some of the substances that are associated with those uses: benzene, copper cyanide, mercury, and naphthalene. So when you zoom into one of the neighborhoods, this is the South Bronx, you'll see that of 171 of these facilities in New York City, 18 of them, or 11%, are both vulnerable to storm surge and located within a half-mile of the South Bronx SMIA. We chose half-mile because that's kind of like the rule of thumb. That's what environmental impact statements look at. In New York State, they tend to look at half-mile impacts. And among the businesses that we researched, we found in this category, was a petroleum bulk station and terminal where the presence of naphthalene was documented. And this is a special health hazard considered to be a carcinogen that can be absorbed through the skin, damaging vision, kidneys, and the liver. And I want to point out there is a square. You probably can't see it, but there's a black square at the top where the South Bronx SMIA is. That square represents the Hunts Point food produce market. That is the food market that handles about 70% of the region's produce. When Sandy hit, when it hit the South Bronx, and it did, there was some flooding in the South Bronx, high tide in the South Bronx was still hours away. Had high tide and the storm surge coincided, that food produce market would have been overrun. And those fist fights at the gas station would have been nothing compared to what we would have been. And the mayor's office has confirmed that this would have contaminated the food supply for the region and nobody knows for how long. This next slide is of the EPA's Community Right to Know Act. You guys know it as a toxic release inventory, and some of the hazardous substances associated with facilities that report these are dioxin, N-hexane, and again naphthalene, acetone. So when you zoom in on one of the other SMIAs, Sunset Park, you'll see that of the 234 of these facilities in New York City, 17 or 7% are vulnerable to storm surge and located within a half-mile of the Sunset Park SMIA. Among the activities that we've seen there is a fossil fuel power generator where the presence of N-hexane is documented. And N-hexane is another special health hazard that can cause reproductive damage with high exposures that can lead to unconsciousness and death. It's also a highly flammable liquid and dangerous fire hazard. These are just a couple of samples. I'm telling you guys, we have over 100 of these maps. And this is, when we talk about who's affected, if you look at who lives within a half mile of the SMIAs, it's about 622,000 New Yorkers. Of those, 433,000 are people of color. Again, you know, it's no surprise. I mean, who's going to live near the heaviest manufacturing zones in the city? There are going to be people that predominantly work there, people walk to work. And so, but just on those, just that one demographic, and there are other demographic analyses of linguistically isolated, disabled, but by every indicator, there is a disproportionate amount of people who are vulnerable living in or near these sites. So physically, what does this mean? So Red Hook is one of the SMIAs, and this photo was taken hours, the day Sandy hit, hours before high tide. As you can tell, it's daylight. High tide didn't hit till nighttime, okay? And as you can see, the waterfront is already overrun. That building on the left, and if you guys know Brooklyn, that's across the street from Fairway. That building is a Civil War era warehouse that's about 98% occupied by small light manufacturers. These are not nefarious. I mean, these are people just doing their jobs. These are printers. These are people just, you know, metal fabricators. These are people conducting legal businesses, but never expected that the East River or Buttermilk Channel would go up on its hind legs and go rushing through their place of business. And these folks have had the watermark went up about 6 or 7 feet, and they were afraid to go back into their own place of business because they knew the chemicals that they were using. So just to wrap up, what we've been doing is we've been organizing now since 2010, calling attention to this issue. And to the city's credit, in the Coastal Zone Management Plan, the Waterfront Revitalization Program, they've included some of our recommendations. We will never know, we're not going to know for a while how much of our recommendations they took, because the day they were going to unveil the last draft of the Coastal Zone Management Plan was October 29th, which is when Sandy hit, which they had to cancel the hearing on account of rain, a lot of rain. Right? I mean, it was just you can't make this stuff up, right? So they've now taken the plan back, and they're working on it. Who knows when it's going to be released. But we realize that in the environmental justice movement, we have a saying that, you know, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? So what we realized is we needed to start organizing, and we've had now a summit and assembly where we brought together the most impacted neighborhoods from Sandy, from Newark all the way to Long Island, and including communities that weren't hit this time but are still vulnerable. And we've come up with our own Sandy recovery agenda that we intend to present to the federal government, the mayor's office and the governor's office, because we realize that we're not going to get what we want if we participate exclusively in these charrettes that are being organized across the region. That the best, most effective way for us to make sure that we're having a resilient and adaptable response to our agenda is to actually have an agenda. So I'll stop there, but I just want to give you guys a sense of how this has played out, at least with the industrial waterfront.